for joining us this week. For those of you who were asking or don't know, I had surgery a little while ago on my knee, and it's doing great. Feel fantastic. If you were here last week, you know we had Chris up here do the welcome. Chris from out in the parking lot did a fantastic job. It was great having him here until he told everybody that I was on drugs, and then I had to answer a lot of questions as people were walking out. But yeah, so anyway, today we're starting a brand new series. It's called Good Directions. Good Directions. And here's how we'll jump in, all right? I want you to think about back when you were younger, like 4 or 5 years old. I remember when I was around that age, I was constantly being asked by old people, which was like everybody, right? What I wanted to be when I grow up. Remember that question? It's like, and it makes sense, but to me it was like the question old people always asked me. And I guess there's not really much else to talk about between those two age groups, but it was always like, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to be? And so I had a few answers at different stages of life. And depending on who was asking the question, if I wanted to please the crowd, I would tell them I want to be a doctor. If I was feeling ambitious, I would tell them that I wanted to play in the NBA, And some of you know I actually did play in the NBA for a few years. I like how the response is just laughter to that. I didn't. At a certain point, I decided I didn't want to get married, and so I would tell my parents that I wanted to be a priest because they didn't have to get married. So I had all these answers. I remember my brother was asked when he was about like 4 or 5 years old, and his response was a dinosaur. And how do you argue with that? You want to be a dinosaur. So it's a great question, And for most of us, what happens is there's that period of life where everyone's asking you that question all the time, but then there comes a point where you stop getting asked that question. And so maybe you stop thinking about what you want to be when you grow up until, if you're like me, until you have to start thinking about it again. Like it's time to decide, am I going to go to college? Am I going to finish high school? What college am I going to go to? Then you make that decision. And you got to decide, if you go to college, you got to decide, well, what am I going to study when I'm there? What do I want to end up doing? And then you get out of school, whether it's high school or college, and you're like, well, do I take that job? Do I take this job? Like, where do I want to go? What do I want to do? What do I want to be? And then you get your job. And maybe you stop asking that question. You stop thinking about what you want to be. But what if we started asking that question again? What if we became the kind of people who were constantly asking that question? And I'm not talking about a job. I'm not talking about an occupation or how you're spending your time 9 to 5. What if we took this question and kind of rephrased it in a more grown-up adult way and asked, where do you want to be in 5 years? And I don't mean where, like what state do you want to live in? Like, are you going to move to Florida or North Carolina? I mean, like, what do you want your life to look like? And maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 1 year. Do you have a picture of what you're working toward? If you think about your close relationships in life, right? Let's say you're married, or let's say you want to be married. How do you want your significant other to describe you 5 years from now? When they're talking to someone and they're like, let me tell you what's so great about him, here's what it is. What do you want them to say? Have you thought about that? If you're in the workplace, what do you want your employees to say about you? What kind of a leader were you? What do you want your employer to say about you? What do you want your kids, if you have kids, when they look back and describe you, what was it like to be your child? What do you want your parents to say about what it was like to be your parent? Do you have a picture of where you want to be in the future? Maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 1 year. You know, it's really interesting. Just this past week, I coincidentally came across this video on YouTube, and there was a former Harvard professor talking to a financial expert, and they were both kind of going back and forth. They were talking about financial habits and savings, and they said, like the finance guy asked the Harvard professor, like, why is it so hard for people to make good financial decisions? You know, does it come down to like self-control, just putting it into practice? And he said, no. Like in this instant gratification culture, because that's what we like to blame it on, you know, all the technology and instant gratification is like, the problem is not actually the technology or the instant gratification. The problem is that has kind of, in a way, caused this generation to stop picturing what they want to be and where they want to go, what they want their life to look like, the kind of people they want to become. And so there's nothing that they're working toward. In other words, in the realm of finances, for the sake of this conversation, they're like, when you get a little extra money and you got to decide, do I want to save this or do I want to go spend it? If you're simply saving because it's like the right thing to do, and yeah, I probably should because I know and I read that book and saving is a good thing to do, that's hard and that requires a lot of self-control. But if you have a clear picture of what you're working toward and what you want to earn, it gets so much easier because it feels like a step in that direction. In fact, that same professor would say, and you can disagree with this if you want, but he said, really what it comes down to in life, like our satisfaction and the happiness that we feel circumstantially, he said, other than the basic like satisfaction that comes from eating a sandwich when you're hungry or sitting down when you're tired, he said, we feel satisfaction when there is a goal and we step toward it. There's a vision and we take a step toward becoming it. Like that's really where that comes from. And so if you haven't taken any time to think about where you're going, it's kind of like you're just walking around aimlessly trying to make the right choice when the right choice feels right and trying to do good things. But really there's no clear direction. And so what if we became the kind of people that thought about the areas of life that mean the most to us? And maybe for you, maybe you need to think about job and the occupation and that whole thing in your season of life, if you're there right now, and just forget about it, because that could become the one thing that distracts you from this whole thing. Maybe it's just the kind of person you want to be. The kind of boyfriend, the kind of girlfriend, the kind of student, the kind of worker. Where do you want to be? Who do you want to be? And then the next question, which is equally as important, is, well, what will it take to get there? In other words, if where I'm going, if my vision of the future, that desired outcome, if that's a destination, then what's going to get me to that destination? Now, a lot of times the way we answer this is with desire. Desire. You know, you got this dream, you gotta want it. You know, you gotta thirst for it. Deep down in who you are, you gotta long for the culmination of that vision. But I think we should bring that into question a little bit, right? Like, so, a couple weeks ago, my wife Allie and I, we were going to this dinner in New York City. It was an anniversary dinner with this group called Orchard Group that helped us start this church. And right after the dinner, we had to fly out because we had a conference in Atlanta. So it was like one thing to the next thing. So we couldn't drive to the dinner. We had to take an Uber into the city. It was like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, worst time to drive into the city. I don't really do well in cars, especially in the back seat of a car. We were in a Prius, you know, we're jammed back there with our suitcases. I'm like just popping Dramamine because I get motion sickness, stop and go traffic. It's like my own personal jail cell. And we're going there, it's taking forever. I'm stressed. I'm trying to figure out when we're gonna get there. We're gonna be late for the dinner. And I'm watching, you know, like a hawk, this Uber driver's little screen where it tells you what's going on. I'm like, okay, well, what's the ETA, right? And finally, this restaurant was like right near the border of like Manhattan and Brooklyn, you know, and then there's water in between. And so it's in Manhattan, we're about to like literally like 200 yards away. There's a little bit of construction, and so we have to kind of make this turn. Next thing I know, we're on a ramp about to cross the Brooklyn Bridge. And there's like no turning back. And I'm sitting there like everything is tense. If I didn't have a wife and 2 suitcases in the back, I would have jumped out of the car, right? And my wife's sitting there next to me. She's like, oh, it's okay. We're just like going into Brooklyn for a minute. We'll turn around. I'm looking at the other side. The cars are stopped. I'm sweating. Our driver's like, oh, sorry about that. I'm like, it's horrible. And I'm just watching. Like, there's the restaurant. It's like right, like, and we're just like in the Prius, we're just like humming away, like, there it goes. What I can tell you is that like in that moment, my desire was not getting me to where I wanted to go. When it comes to a destination, someplace you want to be, it's completely determined by not that your desire, but by the direction that you're headed. In other words, if you're married and you want to be best friends with your spouse, you want to be close, intimate, like there's no one else in the world that's closer to you than your spouse. You can't work 90 hours a week and expect that. You can't work 90 hours a week and expect your kids to feel like you were involved in everything if you're a parent. That direction is not pointed toward that destination. If you want to be healthy and live a long life and have a healthy body, you can't completely neglect your health, right? You're not pointed in the direction of your desired destination. If you want to be seen as someone who can be trusted, as a man or a woman of your word, then you can't keep like tossing out those little white lies, changing the details of the story. That doesn't finish, that road doesn't lead to that destination. If you want that promotion at work, you can't keep dropping the ball in the little things. If you want to be a person of faith, when life gets tough, when you get bad news, when things don't go the way you want it to, and you want to be able to hold on to the idea that God is good and cares, you can't be a person of faith in the difficult times if you neglect the growth of your faith in the easy times. You're just not pointed in that direction. That road does not lead to that destination. And so from there, if we take it a step further, and I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but if there's a destination and the direction determines your destination, then every day on a regular basis, it's your decisions that determine the direction that you're headed in. The not so glamorous everyday moments that seem to not matter all that much are the things that determine the direction that we're headed in. And the thing that's so powerful, like going back to where we started, of having a picture of where you want to be, is that it gives insight into the everyday decisions, right? So think about like this. Anybody have Legos? Or like, anybody step on a Lego? Yeah, okay. So like, let's say your decisions are like Legos, right? And you've got to do something, and maybe it's a moral, ethical thing, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's just, okay, do we buy the house with the nice garage, or do we buy the house with like the nice deck? You know, and so you make a choice, and it looks nice. And maybe you're in a situation at work where you can kind of like compromise a little bit, you know, fudge the truth, do something you wouldn't normally do, but it's gonna end up pretty well for you. Should you do it? I don't know, what seems like the right thing? Well, in this situation, okay, I'm gonna just like whatever, you know? And so you just like build something, and then maybe another time you decide, you know what, actually this time I'm gonna tell the truth. And so and you start to build something, right? And eventually, like, it starts to take shape, and you've got, okay, sometimes I went this way, sometimes I went that way, and I've built something, right? Or you can begin with the destination in mind. This is a house. It's actually built by Tom's son, Nathan. Shout out, Nathan. This is a picture of the destination, of where we want to end up. And so it's funny, I actually heard, there's this guy, his name's Donald Miller, he's written a lot of books. He said he had this vision for his marriage. It's not a right thing, not a wrong thing. He's like, we want our marriage to be restorative. We want people to come into contact with us and just feel refreshed. And so he's got to buy a house, right? And they have a choice. And they're like, okay, do we buy the house with the nice garage or do we buy the house with the nice deck? And, there's a spot for that block because we know what the finished product is going to look like. If we want to have a restorative marriage, we buy the house with the nice deck because we want to have people over. Right? And so it informs everything. If you're in a situation where you got to decide, okay, am I going to say the hard thing? Am I going to be honest here? Well, I don't know. It's going to be really hard. This is especially hard. But if you're like, you know what? No, I decided a long time ago I was going to be the guy that was going to tell the truth no matter what. I was going to be the woman that was true to what I actually said. And so that's very easy. Like in the grand scheme of things, the way this fits into the house that I'm building, it's actually very easy to say the hard thing because you begin with the end in mind. There's this one pastor, he calls this the principle of the path. And what's interesting is that he didn't make it up. It's actually all throughout Scripture. It's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, who wrote a huge chunk of the New Testament, he referred to this as his race. And it was the lens through which he made his decisions. He had this goal. He wanted to go to a city. He wanted to go to Rome. And so there were times, like this is one time he was working in a church in a city called Ephesus, and people loved him. They were like, stay, we love you. Why would you leave? And he's like, no, I know the house I'm trying to build. I love you. You're great, but I got to go. And so he leaves. It was really very clear, though it was actually very hard. This applied to his moral issues as well. When he had to make a tough decision, he knew that he had a picture of the kind of person that he wanted to be. There's a book we call Hebrews, and we're not totally sure who wrote it, but in there, it basically explains that all of us have some kind of race that we're running. We are on a path. There's one theologian that said, life is a highway. Just kidding, he's not a theologian, it's Rascal Flatts. But it's true, it's not just an image. You are where you are right now because of the path that was paved by the decisions you've made. There's an entire book in the ancient Jewish scriptures. It's called the book of Proverbs. It was written by a guy named Solomon, who was a king. He was very well known. He was actually the son of King David, like from David and Goliath. And he writes an entire book about, he wrote most of that book, and it's about making decisions. It's about living life on this path. The book was written to young boys who were just starting out in life. And he writes this it obviously applies to women as well, but he writes this to give them advice, to set them off right. And here's what he says. He says, give careful thought to the path for your feet. Where you're walking, not literally, but he's think about where you come from and where you're going. Are you thinking about how you got to where you are and where your path leads? He says, and be steadfast in all your ways. This word steadfast is not a word that we often use, but it has this idea in the ancient language of being intentional, of stepping with purpose, with intention, of knowing this is the way I'm going. This is where this block goes in my house. It's so easy. It's so easy to just live making good decisions. This feels right. This feels okay. I mean, maybe this is a little bit of a compromise, but if you don't know where you want to end up, you won't know where to turn. And so in this book, it's 31 chapters long, short chapters, but 31 chapters long, and almost a third of the book, the first third of the book has one message. One message. One message. The message, he articulates it like this. He says, the beginning of wisdom, get ready, it's going to knock you off your chair. He says, the beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. Now we know how he became king. He says, though it costs you all you have, get understanding. This guy has everything. He really does. He's got all the women in the world. He's got all the money in the world. He's got all the power in the world. He's got everything. And he's writing to these boys, and he spends like a third of the whole thing just saying, you have to want wisdom. You have to want wisdom. You need the ability to make these good choices. In fact, if we were to look at life as a path, right? If life is a path with a destination and a direction and decisions, well then wisdom comes in as the ability to make decisions. The ability to choose, and it's beyond right and wrong. Like there are situations where who cares? It's not an ethical thing. It's not a moral thing if you're deciding whether to move to the North Shore or the South Shore, whether to buy this thing or that thing, or whether to speak up or to not say it. The vast majority of the decisions in your life have nothing to do with right or wrong. It's not asking what's right, it's asking what's best. Tim Keller actually just recently passed away. He defined wisdom like this. He said, wisdom is competence with regard to the realities and complexities of life. Like there's a way that things work. And having wisdom is becoming aware of the way that things work. And it gives you the ability to make good decisions. Heard somebody say once that wisdom is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but not putting it in a fruit salad. That's wisdom. I don't know if that's perfect, but wisdom is knowing not just what's right, but what's best. And it will help you make decisions. And so Solomon's message to these boys, he spends 30%, almost 30% of this, or 33% of this book saying like, you gotta want it. Though it costs you all you have, get wisdom. And wisdom is personified in these first chapters of Proverbs, meaning it's painted as a person, as a woman. And remember, this was written to young boys, and wisdom is explained as someone you would have a relationship with. Solomon says like, pursue wisdom, protect wisdom, like seek wisdom, want it, cherish it, invest in it. That's how you become a wise person. Someone who navigates life well, who gets to the end of their lives and feels like, sure, I couldn't have predicted this whole thing. It's not like it worked out exactly as I wanted to, but I'm finishing my race well, like the Apostle Paul said. Of course, he couldn't predict everything. He didn't know every decision he was gonna have to make, but he had some kind of picture that can be tweaked, that could be altered, but he knew where he was going. And he had wisdom. It's like a muscle you build. You develop a taste for wisdom. You become someone who is competent or becoming competent with regard to the complexities and the realities of life. And so over the next couple of weeks, what we're gonna do is look at wisdom and how it applies to different areas of life. The idea is to like nourish wisdom, to pursue it, to become people who are wise people. And I'm sure you know this. There are probably people in your life you would look at and be like, yeah, I would consider them wise. And you just go to them for advice just because not because they're experts, but because they just have a knack for the way things work and putting it into practice. And so here are some steps. Here's some steps you can take. And of course, if you're not into this, if you're not a person of faith, if you don't buy anything that Solomon says, that's fine. You can totally just listen. We're happy to have you here. But if you want to put this into practice, here are some things you can do. All right, if life is a path with a destination and a direction and decisions, then the first thing you can do is plan. Plan. Like, spend some time visualizing the kind of person, not that you are, but that you want to be. This might sound kind of morbid, but really, what do you want people to say at your funeral? What do you want to be remembered for? The habits that you have now, 5 years from now, which of those do you want to have kicked? Those goals that you have, which of those do you want to have achieved? You know, I mentioned this Harvard professor earlier. He did this experiment in England. And he took a bunch of people, and he had a bunch of students spend some time, 90 minutes, visualizing their future and the different areas of their lives 5 years from that point. Like, just picture, realistically, where do you want to live? What do you want your house to look like? How do you want to be known? What are some things that you value? Just spend 90 minutes really digging into these key areas of life and develop kind of a picture, a vision of your life. That 90-minute exercise between the group that did it and the group that didn't do it, the group that didn't do it was twice as likely to not make it through school than the group that did. Simply because that 90-minute exercise gave them a destination to work toward. And so what if this week, you don't have to do 90 minutes, you do 15 minutes. But okay, here's where my path has got me so far. And here's where I want to be. In my relationships, in my professional life, with my bank accounts, with the things that I value. I've always talked about maybe wanting to do, I want to do this. I want to arrive here. Maybe just take some time, take it and write it down. Fold it up, put it in your nightstand. You might be surprised how just articulating that vision could change the direction of your life. The second thing, plan, they all start with a P. They're not the best. Proverbs. This whole idea of nurturing, of getting to know wisdom. In the book of Proverbs, there are 31 chapters, which is very convenient because in most months, there are 31 days. And so what a lot of people do is every day, they'll read one chapter in Proverbs. And if you're not used to reading the Bible, this is a great way to start. You don't need to know the whole story. You can just open up literally to a chapter. Like if it's the 5th of the month, you can open up to Proverbs chapter 5. Start right there, and what you'll see is there's these little 2-liners. Sometimes it's 3, depending on how wide the margin is. And it's like little fortune cookies, little ideas. And some of them, I'll tell you right now, some of them you're gonna be like, what in the world does that mean? And you can skip those, or you can look into them, but there'll be at least one every day that you're like, you know what, that makes sense. That hits home. Super practical things. And you start to develop a taste for wisdom. And only take a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes a day. The last thing you could do is gain some perspective. There's this guy, he was around like literally hundreds of years ago. His name was St. Ignatius. He came up with this practice called the prayer of examine. And what he would do at the end of his day, he had a formula for doing it, but at the end of his day, he would take about 15 minutes in his bed or near his bed right before he went to sleep. And he would pray through the previous 24 hours or think through or reflect through or meditate through or whatever you want the previous 24 hours. And you think about every interaction that he had. Okay, what was my first interaction like this morning over breakfast? Then what did I do? What decisions did I make? Who did I talk to? How did those conversations go? People have been doing this for hundreds of years. And some of the questions that they ask as they're looking at their day are like, when are the moments where I felt most alive? And what led me to those moments? Where are the moments where I felt most drained, where life was being sucked out of me? And what led me to those moments? And is there something I can do tomorrow that will bring me more toward life-giving moments and keep me away from the moments that drain me? This is, I think, the perfect picture of giving thought to your ways. Just think about it. We are in such a rush, including myself. We are in such a rush to go to the next thing. Such a rush. And I'm like, okay, I gotta wake up early tomorrow, I gotta go to sleep. You know, I'm like trying to go to sleep, still can't sleep. And you're like, just on to the next thing. We just stop and think, okay, what if we spent some time just thinking, giving thought to the paths of our feet? And maybe for you, if you want to take some steps, again, you don't have to. Maybe you do one of these things or all of these things. But develop a taste for wisdom. See what happens. I'm going to ask the band to come back up here, but here's the story I want to leave you with. So when I was in high school, I didn't care. That was kind of my thing, you know? Whenever my mom would ask me something or give me some news about my poor grades or lack of it, I was like, I don't really care, you know? Or, you know, one of your teachers spoke to me and they said, and I was like, I don't really care. You know, just don't care. And it was almost like something that I took pride in. And so I was like making some really poor decisions in so many different areas of life, which were not setting me up well in any area of life. And my parents couldn't figure out, you know, what to do with me, and I didn't know what to do with me. And at the time, my mom worked in the administrative office of the school. And so it was great. Anytime I got in trouble or like got a bad grade, one of my teachers would just go right upstairs, tell my mom before I knew my grade. But one day I went up there, and as I'm talking to my mom and she's giving me the same talk I've gotten over and over again, the assistant head of school, his name was Keith Singer, he called me into his office, which was great. And he was also my best friend's dad, which was really great for that situation as well. And so he calls me in and he shuts the door behind him, which is how you know it's gonna be fantastic. And he sits me down, and I honestly don't remember the words that he used. But what I do remember, in essence, the message that he left me with was that the path that you are currently on does not lead you to where you want to be. And for me, that was like eye-opening, because it wasn't about doing the right thing. It wasn't about making my parents happy. It wasn't about getting good grades. It wasn't even about like getting into a certain school. It was like almost like he invited me to step back and think, where do you want to be? And is just not caring gonna get you there? And so my hope is that you're not in a situation like that where you just don't care today, but maybe you are. Maybe you're somewhere in between. But I think the question that we would all do well to ask is like, if you look back at how you got to where you are, the current path that you're on, your relationships, your values, your decisions, your habits, do those paths lead you to where you want to be? Or do you need a change of direction? Do you need the ability to make good decisions? Wisdom. What if we all started giving thought to our ways like that?